Welcome to the Stormsurf video surf forecast for Sunday, February 9th. Looking at the significant wave height chart for 18Z on Sunday, we see what appears to be low pressure in the Gulf of Alaska generating 18-foot seas aimed somewhat at Hawaii. A little bit more disturbed pattern off the U.S. West Coast than what we've been seeing in previous weeks. And a low, perhaps gale, developing off Japan, 30-foot seas aimed somewhat at Hawaii and the U.S. West Coast. We'll start this week's tour looking at the jet stream. These are winds at about 30,000 feet. The jet stream tends to drive storm track and helps feed the formation of storms down at lower levels of the atmosphere. So currently we have a rather weak pattern in play. The main flow is pushing off Japan way to the south, down around 25 north, and even reaching to 20 north, which is much further south than we've seen in the past couple of years. But the pattern, the jet splits almost immediately after getting off Japan, working its way up into the Bering Sea, and then starts return flow into the East Pacific. At the same time, the main flow continues meandering along almost right over Hawaii, and then the whole mess tries to congeal north of Hawaii, but wind speeds here are very weak. Basically, you have 100-knot winds, 110-knot winds, maybe making it almost to the date line. It all falls apart, then somehow magically comes together and pushes into the U.S. West Coast over Northern California. But again, wind speeds are very weak. This split flow is not good. There's no real troughs other than this area right here. This trough like that helps to promote counterclockwise circulation in the upper levels of the atmosphere, and also feeds low pressure systems down at the surface, which rotate counterclockwise as well. So the real only area to support gale development in here is this area, but there's just not enough wind to really do a whole lot. Let's put this into motion. As you see, over the next 24 to 48 hours, this trough becomes better defined in the Gulf. Still, the downward flowing winds are exceedingly weak in the 60, 70 knot range, where you really want to see 130 or 140 knots. So there's a good amount of winds building into the U.S. West Coast here, so that would probably direct weather pushing into the Pacific Northwest. But underneath this, clockwise circulation, so you'd have it'd promote high pressure down at lower levels of the atmosphere here, low pressure here, and again the split pattern in the west just really does nothing. So that gets us into about Wednesday. We continue on, same deal, split pattern. We're into Thursday and Friday. Still this trough in the Gulf. Still this kind of ridge pushing into the U.S. West Coast. High pressure south, low pressure north. Dividing line probably somewhere around Northern California, with stormier weather to the north, drier, calmer weather to the south. Continuing into next weekend, the trough continues, weaker now. The ridge into the U.S. West Coast. Pretty much the same thing. The split, notice the split is not as pronounced here. It actually dips south of the Aleutian Islands. So that's a step in the right direction. And then we're into Sunday and, oops, went too far, into late Sunday. And then pretty much you almost have a zonal flow, taking over a huge area from 20 north to 50 north and just going flat across. If this was all condensed down around 30 and span maybe 10 degrees, that would be interesting. But instead it's over a wide area. No real support for gale development here at all, save this little area here. Again, so the Gulf of Alaska is the main thing. Oh, the other thing to notice here, put this back, is the notice where the jet was up into the Pacific Northwest. When you get into Sunday, that trough starts to dip south into the Central California area, which could mean another bout of rain for Central California, maybe even down to Point Conception by Sunday night or Monday. But that's just looking at the upper level atmosphere flow. So in all, not a whole lot to support storm development. Next, let's take a look at surface level pressure and wind speeds. and see what effect the jet stream is actually having on the surface level systems. These are the systems that actually generate swell. You have to have wind blowing on the ocean surface aimed at your direction for a good amount of time over a good area, and with a decent amount of wind speed to generate swell. First area of interest, low pressure, Gulf of Alaska. Winds not very fast, 25 knot winds from the north, pushing down somewhat at Hawaii. Here's the Great Circle Pass. There's a little bit of fetch right here. Also, this fetch is somewhat aimed at the U.S. West Coast here. But again, 25 knot winds, or you're getting maybe 10 or 11 second period wind swell out of it, and that decays pretty fast when it moves away from the source of those winds, swell-wise we're talking. So not a whole lot of production here, probably best for Hawaii. The system off of Japan, that's looking better, 45 knot winds, but a long ways away. Maybe some energy aimed at Hawaii. We'll examine that further when we get into the wave height charts. Put this in motion. You see low pressure continues in the Gulf, but just diffuse, poorly organized. High pressure off the U.S. West Coast. We're into Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Really not a whole lot of the same. High pressure over the dateline in combination with low pressure in the Gulf makes a bit of a gradient, again aimed at Hawaii. So that looks like we're talking 20, barely 25 knot winds. Northern angled wind swell for the islands would be the most likely outcome. Japan, easterly wind swell, but of no real interest to our forecast area. U.S. West Coast, pretty much just some light west winds, 20-25 knots. It's really wind swell for the Pacific Northwest. We're into Thursday. Bigger gale starts to develop now in combination with the high pressure here. That's a gradient, strong difference in pressure, but not strong, but a difference in pressure between the two systems. Helps amp up the wind speeds. Again, these winds pushing well down into Hawaii, down like a 345-degree track, and also into the U.S. West Coast. Not so much. See, most of that energy is cutting across rather than following the Great Circle paths into Northern California. So initially, Hawaii, a potential a swell maker. But then as we get into Friday night and Saturday, the system starts moving more towards U.S. West Coast with good energy into Southern California and to a certain extent Northern California as well. But the system is also dangerously close to the coast. Put this into motion a little bit more, and you see it actually impacts from Northern California northward, a weather event for those locations, and likely even south winds well done into Central California. And we continue on, more fetch yet pushing into the U.S. West Coast. Hawaii's pretty much cut off from this. High pressure, you're into a trade wind pattern there by Sunday, and we run out to the end. So a potential, certainly an onslaught of weather likely for the Pacific Northwest. Where the exact dividing line is, it looks like maybe San Francisco a little bit north. Hard to say rain-wise if we'll get more into below the Central California line and snow for Tahoe or not, but that's kind of where we're at. So let's next examine the effects of those winds on the ocean surface and see what sort of seas those winds are capable of generating. As we looked at right now, low pressure Gulf of Alaska, 18-foot seas at Hawaii, nothing dramatic at all. And that pretty much peters out. A little secondary fetch there, you saw that. Maybe the smallest amount of 20-foot seas later this evening aimed towards Hawaii, but of no real interest. And then we just sort of continue along, another bit of 18-foot seas going into Hawaii down the 336-degree track on Tuesday night. But again, very weak. Good for wind swell for the islands. That's about it. And then you finally get into about Friday and things start waking up. Here we have that fetch of northwest winds. You have 20-22-foot seas pushing into Hawaii down 347-degree track. That's good for north swell. 13, maybe 14-second period if all goes as expected. But none of that really coming towards the U.S. yet. But then by about Friday night, we're having 26-foot seas. And some of that energy certainly coming towards Southern California down the 287 degree track. That's pretty good. You can get into exposed breaks there, and perhaps some sideband energy. I'm sure sideband energy for the U.S. West, for Northern California on the 285 degree track. And then we'll continue to put this into motion. The whole system basically starts plowing right towards Northern California, 20, 22, 24 foot seas, 25 and some 26 up there. So, and we're into Saturday night and Sunday, so that will impact this whole area, probably a good part of California, with more behind it, nearly a little spot of 28 foot seas there, and then growing. And that's into Monday, if you believe the models a week out, which I wouldn't, but this has been on the charts for quite a while. So that would suggest, again, swell for U.S. West Coast, weather for the northern half, and rain and snow in higher elevations, sort of a mixed bag. So we'll see how this plays out, but at least there's something going on. It's not a complete waste of a week. Next, let's take a look at long-term weather indicators. The Southern Oscillation Index here. Difference in pressure between Tahiti and Darwin, and a daily average current minus 6.92. The trend has been very high for a couple of weeks now, unexpectedly high. We get some sense that maybe it's starting to dip, but one day's dip is nothing of any significance. The 30-day average quite high still, 13.09. The 90-day average still pretty high, 7.09. And what we want to really see is a string of negative numbers here, preferably real negative, but we're not seeing that at the moment. Just kind of a middling pattern here going on. But the trend at this point is towards the inactive phase of the MJO, which is not real conducive to storm development. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the atmosphere at the jet stream level and all the way down to the surface. Just kind of, we're in the dead of winter, things should be happening, they're not, and certainly that's because the MJO isn't feeding any energy into the atmosphere. So let's take a look at wind anomalies. These are variations in wind from normal for this time of year for this location. This is the West Pacific, Philippines off here, dateline right here. The trend as of right now is for enhanced easterlies. That is suggestive of the inactive phase of the MJO. Also of note, this area a week ago had very strong westerly winds, fully westerly winds blowing on the ocean surface, a westerly wind burst, and the active phase of the MJO was in control. But that appears to have typically moves east, and that's what it appears from looking here. We now have westerly anomalies on the dateline and moving east from there. We continue on. Here's the dateline. Here's Central America. Weak westerly anomalies going to south of Hawaii, and then sort of an easterly anomaly situation off of Central America, South America. So this sort of suggests the active phase of the MJO is a little bit east of the dateline. This, not necessarily the inactive phase. I'd be expecting to see the inactive phase more here. So we go a week out, the 17th of February. Kind of a neutral pattern is forecast. Weak easterly anomalies, but nothing significant. And just sort of a middling neutral pattern over the dateline too. So not necessarily active or inactive phase, just sort of in no man's land. And then you go from the dateline looking east, still these westerly anomalies, very weak though, in the dateline region, and again the weak easterly anomalies east of that area. So pretty much kind of a neutral pattern is suggested from these charts. Let's look further to the future. This chart is another depiction of what could be suggested to be the both the inactive and the active phase of the MJO. Outgoing long wave radiation, reflectivity off the ocean surface. Blues suggest less reflectivity, cloud cover, and the active phase of the MJO. The yellows and oranges suggest more reflectivity, enhanced trades, and the inactive phase of the MJO. Currently, the charts are suggesting that There's enhanced cloud cover over the Philippines, New Guinea area, and just west of the dateline. This would suggest that the active phase of the MJO is in control there, and this is per the statistic model. Looking out about 5 days, it moves a little bit east and continues. So there's some flavor of the active phase, the week, suggested for the next out to 15 days, so 2 weeks. The dynamic model almost suggests the exact same picture. So both models are in agreement. This is a good sign, and it's good also in that the active phase is what is in control over the dateline area. That's what we want to see. Not particularly strong, but at least it's in the right phase, and the active phase tends to enhance winds in the jet stream, tends to enhance the storm track, and dig out some nice troughs, or at least gives you wind potential for creation of troughs and support storm development in the atmosphere in the North Pacific in the winter. No, not guaranteed because it's weak, but if over the next 2 weeks this pattern does hold, that would be at least suggestive that maybe we'll be in a better place than we are now. The ultra long range upper level model, the greens, suggest enhanced probability for precipitation, or generally the active phase of the MJO. Reds and oranges, the inactive phase. This is a 40-day outlook. Currently, one could interpret this to suggest weak support for the active phase of the MJO, and this wave moves slowly into Central America through the 11th of March. So we're talking almost a month from now before the active phase washes out of the Pacific and heads towards the Atlantic. And then, as is typical, the inactive phase builds behind it, starting about the same time, early March, and then making it somewhere into the mid-Pacific by late March. And this is pretty typical. This chart has been all over the place the past 2 weeks, but it finally seems to have settled out into a pattern that looks somewhat normal, if you would say, a consistent series of waves. It was so muddled before you couldn't even pick out the individual waves or phases of the MJO. So this is looking a little better. Just a quick look back in time. This chart shows wind anomalies. This is the West Pacific here. Here's the well, way beyond the West Pacific. West Pacific is actually here. This is and the East Pacific would be about here. And then this is time down here. So what you really see is this large and strong westerly wind burst that went through pretty much the whole month of January, peaked in about the 28th of January, sending westerly anomalies and real west winds blowing on the ocean's surface in the far West Pacific. Prime conditions for development of a Kelvin wave. Next, we'll get into sea surface temperature anomalies, variations from normal for this time of year. Our prime focus has been this area, warm water building up on the equator off of Central and South America. It was actually extending pretty well out here to the west, but then about 2 weeks ago the temperatures started really dropping off, and now there's actually pockets of cold water in the prime Nino areas. This is suggestive of the upwelling phase of a Kelvin wave that actually pushed into this area, resulting in these warm water temperatures. You get sort of this cold backlash thing that comes after the Kelvin wave moves in. Not completely unexpected, but the strength of this phase of it is a little bit perplexing. And the suspicion is that because the water temperatures have cooled, that's also setting up high pressure here. That's also driving the SOI to go positive and sort of giving the atmosphere this general sense of the inactive phase of the MJO. That could be a bit of a reach of an analysis, but that appears to be what's going on. Elsewhere, warm water, again, between Japan and U.S. West Coast. It was actually starting to almost impact Northern California at one point, but it looks like it's backed off a little bit. But it'll be interesting to see days of south wind and rain up in this area might help fill this in yet again. So, but in general, this is kind of a mixed pattern. Nothing really warm, nothing really cold, pockets of both at the same time. We sometimes look over here for a sympathetic cool pool to develop. There was some suggestion south of the equator a couple weeks back, but that's all filled in, isn't here, so it doesn't really look like there's a teleconnection of any kind developed. It's just kind of a muddled, mixed pattern at this point in time. Now let's look at subsurface water temperatures. Variations from normal for this time of year on this lower chart. And what is really striking is this large pool of warm water, 3+ degrees, and it's, pull this up, there's the date line there. It's made it east to almost 130, maybe even 125. We believe this is the effect of that Kelvin wave that blew all the month of January. What happens? West winds blow on the ocean surface. It actually pushes warm water that's normally in the West Pacific to depth, and then that pocket of warm water makes itself the whole way across, or makes its way the whole way across the Pacific, impacting Ecuador and that area on the equator, gurgling back to the surface, and then feeding the developing warm pool in the East Equatorial Pacific. The one thing of notice here is this pocket of cooler waters, a little down to almost 2 degrees here at 110 west. But notice it's also showing up at the surface too, which is that that cool pool that we saw south of Hawaii. Again, the thought is this is the upwelling phase of a previous Kelvin wave that's already made it off the end of the chart. The thought is this will moderate in time, and this Kelvin wave will come in, blast it out of there, and power through. But at this time, it appears to be it sort of acts as a cap. Normally when you're in like a La Nina, you'll actually see the cold water set up at depth right here and literally be like a brick wall. We're not seeing this. It almost looks like the Kelvin wave could undercut it and that'd be the end of it. But we're not going to say that's going to happen until we actually see it happening. The one thing of note is this Kelvin wave is already making good eastward progress. So this is going to be a couple of weeks at least to see, because it moves rather slow. It's amazing how far it's gone. It wouldn't be surprising to see it actually retreat a little bit before it really makes its big push in. It's normally almost a 2 to 3 months to get across the Pacific. So the size of this pool and the amount of eastward drive on it is surprising and significant at this point in time. Again, a quick look here at the rising SOI. This has been what looks to be a strong inactive phase of the MJO that was happening in the Central Pacific at the same time the westerly wind burst was happening in the West Pacific. So a little bit of a head scratcher here, but that just sort of talks to the mixed message the ocean and the atmosphere is sending. Basically neutral, but wanting to swing one way or the other, just not quite making it. And finally, sea surface temperature forecast for the Nino 3.4 region, which is basically that area on the equator between Hawaii and almost into the about halfway into Central America. The models have this model has consistently suggested warming up to about 1.2 degrees above normal by October of this year, and even warming half a degree by April. Whether this happens, who knows? The model has been showing this for the better part of 2 or 3 years now, and then you think you see it starting to happen, it backs off. So it's just it's an educated guess by a computer, but nothing that we would bet on at this point in time. That said, there are more things in play right now, specifically that big Kelvin wave and even the Kelvin wave right before it. We haven't had any Kelvin wave activity for 2 years of any magnitude, so it's a step in the right direction. Certainly we're neutral now, and starting to make some inroads perhaps into a warmer regime in the next couple of months. So for now, that's pretty much it. The big focus is on the Kelvin wave. That's the area of excitement or interest for now. Surf-wise, the pattern's pretty benign. Weather-wise, there's been a good amount of snow in the Tahoe region, 50 inches over the past several days. So that's a good step, and rain north of central California. So a little bit of help to the drought, but not much. But it's better than where we were. Thank you for watching this week's forecast. We'll do it again next week, same time, same channel. Thank you. Bye-bye.